Tensions ran high at the Alberta legislature Saturday. The Rally for Alberta Independence drew hundreds to the legislature grounds in support of the province separating from Canada after the Liberals won the federal election earlier this week.
Alberta, one of Canada's wealthiest and most resource-rich provinces, is once again stirring national and international attention with a growing wave of separatist sentiment, often referred to as Wexit, a play on the United Kingdom's Brexit. This movement raises the question, could Canada face its own political rupture?
As we've seen this week, a lot of Albertans want out of Confederation. They want to sit around the new nation of Albertania with all their oil and their money and an eternal loop of watching the Oilers play the Flames and the Flames play the Oilers. And before every game, the fans will stand and face the Alberta flag, a pickup truck wearing a cowboy hat, and sing the Alberta national anthem. This is how you remind me. But if they leave, it's a slippery slope. It could lead to other provinces wanting to leave, and then all the other provinces arguing over who gets to hold the door open for them on the way out. A very, very civil war. Saskatchewan would be the next to leave because they wish they were Alberta, only instead of oil, they're the world's breadbasket. Good luck with that now that everybody's on keto. Quebec are the OG separatists. They'd be out faster than you can say bye-bye, mon cowboy. The French half of New Brunswick would go with them, and then the English half would join Nova Scotia and form a new Nova Scotia, Nova Scotia. Then PEI would separate and quickly descend into anarchy, which is an Anne of Green Gables monarchy. And Newfoundland would get unfound and form a new country by making everyone in the province get screeched out. That's when you kiss a cod goodbye. Meanwhile, the coast of BC is just an earthquake away from literally separating, and the rest would throw themselves into the Pacific to avoid being stuck next to Alberta. Yukon, Nunavut, and the Northwest Territories would recombine as the United Territories of Russia. And finally, Manitoba and Northern Ontario will combine to become the 51st state, Norther Dakota. Southern Ontario would separate because everybody hates driving on the 401, leaving Toronto as the only place left in Canada, and they wouldn't even notice because they never thought they were part of the country in the first place.
The roots of Alberta's discontent lie deep in its economic and political history. For decades, many Albertans have felt that Ottawa fails to recognize or respect the province's unique challenges, particularly regarding energy policy and federal equalization payments. Despite being a powerhouse of oil and gas production, Alberta claims it's burdened by policies that hurt its economy, such as carbon taxes, pipeline delays, and regulatory constraints.
As Brexit negotiations reach their final stage, scrutiny on the negotiation process and on what the final deal may look like is intensifying. Some of this scrutiny has resulted in calls to the Prime Minister, who is leading the negotiations on the basis of the Chequers plan, to change strategy completely. This has led to an increasing tension between Remain and Leave camps, who have very different and often opposing ideas of the route that the PM should take. For example, there are calls from prominent members of the Remain camp for a second referendum, whereas those on the Leave camp want the PM to chuck Chequers in favour of a swift exit from the EU, negotiating instead a free trade deal. One of the approaches often cited by Brexiteers is a Canada-style trade agreement, a Canada plus. Prominent Brexiteers such as Boris Johnson and David Davies have even gone as far to say that this approach would be easy given the fact the UK is already a member of the EU. But what is a Canada-style free trade agreement, and is it feasible? In order to answer these questions, we must first look at the agreement that Canada has with the EU. Negotiated over 5 years ago, the Canada-EU trade deal, known officially as the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, CETA for short, came into force on the 21st of September 2017. As the title suggests, CETA is comprehensive, covering everything from trade of goods to investment and labour mobility. The objective of CETA, as stated by both the EU and Canada, is to liberalise trade borders between the two countries, with the hope of increasing trade. Let's take a look at how it achieves this. First of all, tariffs on 99% of EU and Canadian goods will ultimately be eliminated. This includes industry tariffs, tariffs on the trade of fish, and tariffs on agricultural products, including the ones you see on screen now. Secondly, CETA relaxes some of the regulatory barriers for foreign investment. For example, Canada will allow EU investors to acquire Canadian firms up to the value of 1.5 billion Canadian dollars without government review, instead of the previous value of 354 million Canadian dollars. It also simplifies the investment dispute procedure in case of a trade dispute. And on services, particularly management and financial, CETA sets out guarantees from both sides that the regulatory framework will not become restrictive for the other party in the future. Finally, and in addition to all of that, CETA creates new provisions for government procurement, intellectual property rights, and geographic indications. It also, and pioneeringly so, sets out agreements on sustainable development and trade, including environmental and labour standards. So if this agreement, dubbed by the EU as the most comprehensive trade agreement ever agreed between the EU and a third party, is to form the basis of a post-Brexit EU-UK relationship, what might the so-called Canada Plus deal entail? Well, let's start with the easy things. On goods, it's likely that the provisions set out by CETA will be replicated. That would mean that 99% of tariffs and quotas on all goods traded between the UK and EU would eventually be eliminated. An area where quotas may remain is in the fishing industry. This seems logical, with exiting the common fisheries policy and taking back control of British waters being a key argument put forward by the Leave campaign. However, given the importance of British waters to EU fishing vessels, the EU is likely to want to negotiate preferential access of some kind. Now let's move on to services. This is where things become more difficult. The original CETA deal, which the new Canada Plus deal would be based upon, doesn't cover services in very much detail, and certainly doesn't remove any barriers in trading services. All it does is provide a guarantee that the regulatory environment will not become restrictive for services. This is a concern for the UK, as more than 79% of the UK's GDP comes from the service sector. Moreover, financial services alone account for 65% of the UK's GDP, providing 1.1 million jobs and contributing £118 billion to the UK's overall output. Proponents of a Canada Plus deal argue that the plus refers to a bespoke deal on services and will ensure that the UK's financial sector continues to have access to the EU markets. Though the details on how this deal might materialise are lacking, we can take a look at the current agreements to get an idea of what would need to be negotiated. Currently, UK firms in the financial sector have access to EU markets through passporting rights. These rights enable firms in any EU or EEA state to trade freely with any other firm in an EU or EEA state, without the need for additional authorisation. This allows firms to send employees to or do deals with clients in any other EU or EEA state for the purpose of providing financial services. However, these rights are based on a single rulebook for financial services in the EU and EEA. Therefore, in countries outside of the EU and EEA, so-called third countries, of which the UK will be part of given the government's insistence that the UK will leave the EU and EEA, these third countries do not have passporting rights available to them, but can, in some cases, qualify under the EU's third country regime for limited access to its firm's services. In order to qualify, the third country must have a regulatory regime accepted by the EU as equivalent to EU standards. As the UK is exiting the EU after 40 years of regulatory alignment, it's safe to say that the UK would qualify for this status, and would therefore be able to have some access to EU markets above other third countries.
Tensions escalated under Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's leadership, with his environmental agenda clashing sharply with Alberta's oil-driven economy. Even with Trudeau's recent departure and Mark Carney stepping in as Prime Minister, frustration remains high. Critics argue that successive federal governments, regardless of party, have neglected Alberta's interests. Support for separation isn't just idle talk. Polls in recent years have shown that a significant portion of the province's population is open to the idea of independence. Though not yet a majority, the number is large enough to demand national attention. Some groups have gone further, organizing rallies, launching political parties, and proposing economic blueprints for an independent Alberta. At the heart of this movement is the question of economic autonomy. Alberta contributes billions more to the federal government than it receives in return, leading many to ask, why stay in a system that doesn't feel fair? Advocates of separation envision a future where Alberta controls its own energy resources, taxation, and foreign policy, free from what they see as the burdens of Canadian federalism. However, there are major obstacles. First, the Canadian Constitution doesn't provide a clear path for provinces to secede. Any attempt to leave would face legal, political, and logistical challenges. There's also the question of Indigenous land rights, as many First Nations have treaties with the federal government, not the province. Their stance on Alberta leaving Canada would be crucial and potentially decisive. Then there's the economic reality. While Alberta's oil wealth is substantial, global energy markets are volatile. An independent Alberta would need to build diplomatic relations, create its own currency, or adopt another, and establish trade agreements from scratch, all while potentially losing the economic security that comes with being part of a larger federation. Nationally, the idea of Alberta separating is deeply polarizing. Some Canadians outside Alberta sympathize with its grievances, while others see the movement as short-sighted or fueled by misinformation. Many fear that any serious attempt at separation could fracture Canadian unity and encourage similar movements in other provinces. As it stands, Alberta has not taken any formal steps toward independence, but the pressure is building. If the federal government cannot bridge the growing divide, the calls for separation may get louder, more organized, and harder to ignore. Whether Alberta's frustrations will lead to reform, more autonomy, or an outright attempt at independence remains uncertain. But one thing is clear: the question of Alberta's place in Canada is no longer just a fringe issue. It's a national conversation,